Let's get right into it. Number 10. The Real-Life Cannibal Prophecy. In 1838, Edgar Allan Poe wrote a story about a shipwrecked crew that eats their cabin boy named Richard Parker. 46 years later, a real crew gets shipwrecked and eats their cabin boy, also named Richard Parker. This isn't some creepy internet story. This actually happened. In Poe's novel, 4 shipwrecked sailors draw straws to decide who gets eaten. The loser was a cabin boy named Richard Parker. Fast forward to 1884. A yacht called the Mignonette sinks. 4 crew members end up stranded in a tiny lifeboat. After 19 days without food, 3 of them decide to eat the weakest member of their crew, and his name was Richard Parker. The real Richard Parker was just 17 years old. He was already dying from drinking seawater when his crewmates decided to speed up the process. They stabbed him in the neck with a penknife. When they got back to England, they were arrested for murder. The case became famous because it established that being really hungry doesn't make it okay to kill someone. The captain and mate were sentenced to death, but their sentences were commuted to just 6 months in prison. The similarities don't stop at the name. In both stories, the victims were the youngest crew members, and both were eaten over several days by 3 other crew members. Number 9. The Japanese Tsunami Stones. You're walking along the coast of Japan, and you spot this ancient stone with writing on it. It's been standing there for over 600 years, warning anyone who reads it, don't build any houses past this spot. In 2011, when the Tohoku tsunami hit Japan, 2 villages right next to each other faced the same massive wave. One village ignored their ancestors' warning and built their homes below the stone marker. The other village, Anayoshi, built everything above it. The village below the stone got completely wiped out. In Anayoshi, not a single home was lost to the tsunami. These stones are ancient high-water marks placed by survivors of previous tsunamis. Think of them as the world's oldest, "You must be this tall to build here" signs. One stone says, "If an earthquake comes, beware of tsunamis. High dwellings are the peace and harmony of our descendants. Remember the calamity of the great tsunamis. Do not build any homes below this point." It's like getting a letter from your great-great-grandfather saying, "Hey, future kid, don't do this stupid thing that got all my friends killed." Scientists found out that tsunamis of that exact size hit Japan every 400 to 600 years. These ancient people weren't just lucky guessers. They knew what was coming. Number 8. The Chernobyl Star. In the Bible's book of Revelation, a star falls from heaven. The star is called wormwood, and it's supposed to poison 1/3 of Earth's waters. Chernobyl means wormwood in Ukrainian. The worst nuclear disaster in history happened at a place named after a biblical poison star. The passage says this star would fall from heaven, burning like a torch. When the Chernobyl reactor exploded, witnesses described seeing a bright blue column of light shooting into the night sky. It looked exactly like a falling star. The radioactive fallout contaminated rivers, lakes, and groundwater across Europe. Scientists estimate that about 1/3 of Belarus's water sources were contaminated. Even today, some mushrooms in parts of Europe are still too radioactive to eat. The Bible says this star would make waters bitter as wormwood. Survivors who drank contaminated water described it as having a metallic, bitter taste. The area around Chernobyl had been called by that name for centuries before the disaster. The place was wearing a name tag for hundreds of years that said future nuclear disaster site. Number 7. The prophecy of Tyre's fall. The prophet Ezekiel made a prediction about the city of Tyre. He said the mighty city would fall, and its ruins would be scraped clean and thrown into the sea. That's extremely specific. Tyre was basically the New York of the ancient world, loaded with cash, protected by massive walls, and it sat partly on an island, making it practically impossible to attack. The Phoenicians who lived there probably laughed when they heard Ezekiel's prediction. About 250 years later, Alexander the Great shows up. When the island part of Tyre refused to surrender, he had a creative solution. He took the entire mainland city and used it to build a bridge to the island. His army literally scraped the mainland city clean. Every stone, every beam, every brick, they threw it all into the sea to build a causeway. Ezekiel's prophecy came true in the most literal way possible. You can still see this causeway today. It's now a peninsula connecting what was once the island to the mainland. Number 6. H.G. Wells and the Atomic Bomb. In 1914, H.G. Wells published The World Set Free. In his book, Wells described bombs that would continue to explode for days. He called them atomic bombs. This was 30 years before anyone had even successfully created a nuclear chain reaction. He wrote about cities being wiped out by these endless explosions. He described radiation poisoning without even knowing what radiation was. Then, in 1932, a physicist named Leo Szilard read Wells' book. In 1933, inspired by what he had read, Szilard figured out how nuclear chain reactions would work. Szilard later said the book showed him it was possible. He went on to help create the actual atomic bomb. A science fiction writer imagined something so vividly that it helped scientists figure out how to actually build it. Wells even predicted how these bombs would change warfare forever. He wrote that once atomic bombs existed, no city would be safe. He said they would force humanity to choose between civilization and destruction. In his book, the world's governments eventually ban atomic bombs because they're too dangerous. In reality, we're still working on that part. Number 5. The London Fire Astrologer. Imagine being so good at predicting the future that you get arrested for it. This was the reality for William Lilly, a 17th-century astrologer who saw London's future going up in flames. In 1651, Lilly published a book filled with cryptic illustrations. One of these drawings showed a city on fire, with two figures representing the Gemini twins, London's astrological sign, tumbling from the sky. 15 years later, in 1666, London actually burst into flames. The Great Fire of London destroyed 13,200 houses and left 100,000 people homeless. The authorities dragged Lilly in front of Parliament for questioning. The accusation was that he must have helped start the fire. Lilly managed to talk his way out of trouble. He had to convince them that his prediction was just based on astrology, not on any actual plans to burn down London. The Great Fire wasn't his only accurate prediction. He also predicted the English Civil War and the execution of King Charles I, all through these strange hieroglyphic drawings. Number 4. The Prophecy of the Wooden Wall. So you're in ancient Athens. The largest army ever assembled is coming to wipe your city off the map. The Persians are coming, and you're outnumbered. So the Athenians send some guys to the Oracle of Delphi, the ancient world's version of a fortune-telling superstar. The oracle gives them this cryptic message: only the wooden wall shall not fail. Most Athenians were like, oh, that's easy. Let's build a big wooden fence around the city, which is like trying to stop a tank with a picket fence. But then this guy named Themistocles comes along. He says, hey guys, maybe she's not talking about an actual wooden wall. Maybe she's talking about ships. Some people thought he was crazy. Building a navy instead of walls is like choosing to buy a boat when someone's about to bulldoze your house. But he was absolutely right. The Athenians built 200 warships. When the Persian army showed up, they found an empty city and a fleet of warships waiting to ruin their day. The Athenians used these ships to lure the Persian fleet into a narrow strait called Salamis, like tricking a bunch of monster trucks into racing through a parking garage. The Persian ships crashed into each other, while the more agile Greek ships picked them off one by one. The Persians lost about 300 ships that day. The Greeks lost 40. Number 3. The Roman poet who saw germs. A poet named Lucretius wrote a poem called On the Nature of Things. Most poets back then were writing about love, war, and gods throwing lightning bolts. But this guy was writing about invisible seeds floating through the air that can make you sick. At a time when people thought diseases were caused by angry gods or bad smells, Lucretius was describing germ theory. He said there are these tiny invisible things flying around everywhere. He called them seeds of disease, and said they were so small no one could see them. He wrote that these tiny seeds could travel on the wind and get inside people's bodies. That's basically what we now know as viruses and bacteria. Lucretius said these invisible seeds could multiply and spread from person to person. He even suggested that different diseases had different types of seeds. This guy basically wrote the rough draft of germ theory while people were still fighting lions in the Colosseum, and nobody would prove he was right for almost 2,000 years. It wasn't until the 1600s when von Leeuwenhoek looked through a microscope and discovered tiny organisms. Imagine trying to convince someone in ancient Rome that their fever was caused by invisible floating seeds. They'd probably think you were nuts. But now, 2,000 years later, we know he was right all along. Number 2. The Tunguska Event Warning. Imagine you're living in Siberia in the early 1900s. You've heard stories from your grandparents about Agdi, the thunder god, who would one day split the sky with fire. The local Evenki people had been telling this story for generations. They said Agdi would bring destruction from above, creating a blast of heat that would flatten entire forests. Most people laughed it off as just another myth. Then on June 30th, 1908, something massive exploded over the Siberian wilderness. The blast flattened 80 million trees over 830 square miles. That's like wiping out all of New York City and most of its suburbs. The explosion released 1,000 times more energy than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. People 40 miles away were thrown off their feet by the shockwave. The heat was so intense that witnesses said their shirts caught fire from miles away. Everything the Evenki people had predicted matched what happened that day. The sky splitting with fire, the great heat that burns from above, the forests bowing down. The Evenki people had specifically warned everyone to stay away from that exact area. They said it was where Agdi would return. Scientists today think it was a meteor or comet that exploded in the atmosphere, but they still can't explain how the Evenki people seem to know something would happen in that specific location. Number 1. The Oracle Who Was Never Wrong. The Oracle of Delphi was ancient Greece's most famous fortune teller, and she had a special talent for giving predictions that were always right, just not in the way you expected. King Croesus was the Jeff Bezos of ancient times, so rich we still use the phrase rich as Croesus today. Croesus was worried about the Persian Empire next door. He goes to the oracle to ask if he should attack them. The oracle tells him, "If you cross the river Halys, a great empire will fall." Thinking this was his green light, Croesus gathers his army and crosses the river, and a great empire did fall, his own. The oracle was breathing in intoxicating fumes that put her in an altered state. Scientists have found evidence of ethylene gas seeping through cracks beneath her temple. This stuff causes hallucinations and trance-like states, so she was basically high while giving these prophecies, and yet, her cryptic predictions kept coming true, often in the most ironic ways. Kings, generals, and philosophers all made the trek to Delphi to hear these riddles, and time after time, they learned the hard way that you should always read the fine print. That's all for today. I'll be making similar videos in the future. Subscribe to see them.